Okay, gentlemen, welcome to a tutorial about the scientific method. We're going to use the scientific method tutorial and the following tutorial about formal lab report writing um, as part of our lessons and instruction on how and why scientists write about their experiments. This scientific method provides the framework for how scientists um, conduct their experiments, write about their experiments, and eventually share out the results of their experiments. And we're going to go through all of these processes over the next few weeks as we focus on experiments and experiment writing. There's some important vocabulary here with scientific method that you need to be aware of, familiar with, and comfortable with before you get to class, before we start talking about this in class, and before you start conducting and creating your own experiments. The first here is asking a question. And the question is what starts the whole experiment process, and creating a question that you will work to answer through the experiment. And the key to this question is that it is what we call a testable question, meaning that you can test it, you can collect data and observations, and eventually, later on down the scientific method here, you will work to answer your question. So the question must be what we call testable, meaning you can collect data, numbers, and observations during your experiment to work to answer that question. So that's the testable question. Two other important vocabulary words when it comes to questions, and this also relates to the background research. The first of which is control. For every experiment that scientists run, they have what's called a control. And the control is what all of the rest of the experiment is compared to. So in the control, nothing is altered or changed. Whereas in other experiments, there are parts of that experiment that are changed and then compared to the control. So for our plant growing experiment, my plants that I will grow will be the control. And so you will compare your plants and your results to mine. I will conduct the experiment along with you. I will collect data and observations just like you will, but I will do mine on the control, meaning I'm not going to alter or change anything on my plants. So the control is important for any experiment. Variable is the other important vocabulary word. Now, variables, and this is where your questions come in and where your experiment is. A variable is something that is changed in an experiment. And when you run an experiment, you are testing to see how that variable changes whatever the experiment is you're running. So for our example, we're going to be growing plants. And so maybe a variable that you change is that you water your plants with salt water. I'll be watering my plants with fresh water. Or maybe you change the type of soil. Maybe you plant your plants in sand, whereas mine is planted in regular dirt. You could also limit the amount of light that your plants have. You keep your plants in the closet. So that is something that you would change in your experiment. Part of your question, part of your testable question, you are manipulating a variable, changing something in yours, and comparing that to my control bottle. The important thing with variable is that you only change one at a time. So for your experiment, you will change a single variable, and that will be changed, and you'll ask your question about that. The reason we only change one variable at a time is that if we manipulate and change more than one variable, you can't tell which variable you're actually measuring. For example, comparing again to my control plants, if you change the type of water that you water your plants with, so salt water, and you keep them in the closet away from sunlight, you don't know which of those two things, the salt, water, or the light, or lack of light, is what makes the changes occur in how your plants are different than mine. So you only test for one variable at a time. Okay? Moving through our scientific method, once you've created your question, you've understood control versus variable, you'll construct a hypothesis. That's your educated guess about what you think is going to happen based on maybe prior experience you have, or other experiences you have with growing plants or gardening or other things like that. We'll then run for a couple of weeks and test your hypotheses, work on answering your question. We're going to collect and analyze a bunch of data and observations throughout this experiment. We'll get into that a little bit later on. And finally, the last step here, reporting your results and judging whether your hypothesis was correct. This is where scientists kind of culminate their experiment. They write what's called a written conclusion, and this is the sharing out of scientific results. So this is the scientific method, provides the framework for how we write about experiments, starts with a testable question, runs through control, variable, gathering of data, your hypothesis, and finally writing the conclusion. Thank you.